Hello everyone, and welcome to your lecture today on representations of themes and socio-historical context in epic television dramas. Today we're using Peaky Blinders as an example, but hopefully you'll pick up the skills to be able to identify themes and identities in TV epics. We're also going to be building the generalizable skill of understanding how directors build tension on screen. In the first session, so this recorded session, we're going to be looking at some of the themes that we're hoping to identify in the first episodes of Peaky Blinders. I'm going to cover a brief bit of history, so the context of Birmingham in 1919, so that the first episode of Peaky Blinders is easier to investigate for these themes for you, so that you have a basic understanding of the context at the time. Now, these themes include soldiers returning from war, political tensions, the suffrage movement, and the IRA. We're then going to go over a relevant theory, social identity theory, and this will help you to understand how the groups in Peaky Blinders interact with each other and their social identities. We will then look at methods of building tension on screen, so how directors build tension using different types of shot and sound. And then I'm going to be telling you about the rules of the game. Now, this game is called Blind Bingo, and it's a game that I've been working on for you to help you to show me that you've been listening and learning the skills that I've been teaching you in seminars throughout this module, and B, enter those of you who engage with this task into a prize draw to win a £10 Amazon voucher. So, in the second session, this is going to be in your own time. The second session is simply watching episode 1 of Peaky Blinders on Netflix. I'd like you to identify the themes, context, and identities discussed in the first hour, and use the bingo cards that are available on Moodle to track these themes. And then you have an optional post-session activity. So not all of you will be interested in television and film, so you don't have to engage in this activity if you don't want to. But if you're finding yourself with time on your hands during this period of isolation, you might want to get involved with this activity to practice your skills and have the potential to win a £10 Amazon voucher. So, you will then need to submit your Peaky Blinders bingo card filled out, and I'll explain that later, how you fill it out, and your defence of the bingo card. You have until the end of the day on Thursday to complete this bingo card and submit to me your defence, and I will announce the winner on Friday. I will then ask the winner for their email address and ask them if they want it to be sent to their university email address or a private email address, and they will receive an Amazon e-voucher. So it's exactly the same as a normal Amazon voucher. I just don't have to ask you for your home address to send it to you. So let's start with Birmingham in 1919. The first theme that we're going to discuss is soldiers returning from war. So this is both a theme and a social identity. People at the time would have had the social identity of being a soldier that went off to fight in war, and the social norms and expectations that came with that will guide their behaviour in the way that we've spoken about in our social psychology lectures. So the vast majority of able-bodied men went off to fight in the war. They were conscripted to fight in the war, and they did not have a choice, or they were strongly encouraged to fight in the war. Now that is because those who didn't were often shamed. So men who were able-bodied but conscientiously objected to the war effort were shamed as being unpatriotic and cowardly. And those who went off to fight in the war probably experienced a lot of resentment and anger towards those who didn't, as a result of their horrific experiences at war and the way that these men had been able to avoid those. Those who did return from war often experienced something called shell shock. This is what it was called at the time. However, we now know that this is a form of PTSD. We covered PTSD a few lectures ago, so I'm not going to go into that in detail now. But those of you who want to engage with Blinder Bingo, if you want to explore PTSD a little more within Peaky Blinders, you could have your PTSD notes in front of you when you're watching the episode to identify the obvious but also much more subtle representations of PTSD in those soldiers who returned from war. Finally, soldiers who returned from war were given no support. Nowadays, when soldiers return from war, we understand that they've experienced things that are terribly traumatic. However, at the time, although soldiers' experiences were understood to be very negative and traumatic, we didn't understand the lasting impact that trauma had on people. So there was no support for soldiers returning from war, no emotional support for soldiers who were returning, and they returned to a cramped and impoverished Birmingham. So these workers who had been forced to go off and fight in the First World War returned to no support and poor living conditions. In addition to those poor living conditions, they also had terrible working conditions, and this is what inspired the political tensions. So in the 1800s, quite a bit before the first episode of Peaky Blinders was set in 1919, but after the Industrial Revolution began, men were being made to work in appalling working conditions, with no protective equipment and breathing in gas and smoke all day, every day. Young children were also expected to work in factories, and often these were children far younger than 10. People then began to lobby against these poor working conditions and against the use of child labour. And in fact, one of the first workers' unions was designed to help children stay out of the workhouses until they were at least 10 years old. In 1900, several political groups, backed by unions, banded together to form the Labour Party, affiliated with the Socialist International. Now, this Labour Party was created to give the working man a voice. The Communist League was then founded in 1919, so this brings us to present day in the first episodes of Peaky Blinders. Now, the Communist League contained mainly militant far-left activists, and these people were actively protesting against the use of or against poor working conditions for working class people. These were men who had been shipped off to war only to return to poverty and unfair working conditions. They had a "what did we fight for and what did they die for" mentality. They'd gone to war and experienced these terribly traumatic things, and yet when they returned, they were not returning as war heroes, they were returning to being another cog in a dirty machine. Right-wingers then became very worried about this movement, because this then caused a lot of tension. They were concerned that they would see what had happened in Russia with the Bolshevik movement, so a socialist movement that created a lot of political upheaval in Russia. They were concerned for a Bolshevik-style uprising that might be imminent in Great Britain. And you can see this tension and concern in the first episodes of Peaky Blinders. So the suffrage movement in 1919 is the third theme that we're going to explore today. 1919 was an exciting time for women's suffrage. This is what had happened until that point. So the suffrage movement was the fight for women's right to vote. Late in the 1800s, the women's suffrage movement gained momentum with the formation of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society. By 1906, the public opinion had finally swung in the favour of these women's plight, and the Women's Social and Political Union began to aggressively campaign for women's suffrage. However, This movement ground to a halt when the World War started in 1914. So until this point, the suffragettes were engaging in militant-style protests in order to gain suffrage for women, so their right to vote. However, in World War One, or at the beginning of World War One, these protests ground to a halt because the nation's perspective was very much focused elsewhere. As World War One began, the WSPU halted their militant political action. This is because Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of this movement at the time, had decided that Germany posed the bigger threat, and so women and men alike needed to band together in order to protect the UK. Instead, they moved towards peaceful protests, and these were also guided by Emmeline Pankhurst, pictured here. As almost all able-bodied men had gone to fight in the war, women now had to fill these roles. So women had occupations, women were working in factories. The roles that men had held before were slightly simplified so that women and children could do them, although over time women became more and more competent in these roles and therefore were doing just as good a job as the men were doing previously. This led to a whole new view of what a woman was capable of doing. Women had gained a whole new respect. Anti-suffrage hostility that was caused by their pre-war militant tactics declined as respect for women was increased. Previously, the right to vote had been based on occupational requirements, but this led to two issues in discussions about who should have the right to vote. The first being that women now had occupations. They now met these occupational requirements, so why couldn't they vote? The second was that men who were fighting in war technically no longer had occupations. They legally did not meet those occupation requirements. And so either women should be given the right to vote because they had occupations, or soldiers should have their right to vote taken away from them because they no longer had occupations. Now, the worst case scenario, obviously, was that people who had left their country to go and fight for their country should then have their vote taken away from them. So, women were slowly given the right to vote. In 1918, Parliament passed the Act granting the vote to women over the age of 30. There was some small print regarding owning different types of houses, etc., or being married to someone who owned property. However, that's not important for our class today. What is important is that about 8.4 million women gained the right to vote. So the final theme we're going to discuss is the Irish Republican Army, so the IRA. We're not going to go into too much detail about this, only to explain why it's relevant to Birmingham in 1919. So there were tensions between some social groups, so the Fenians in Ireland and the British. So Ireland was at the time part of the UK. In the middle of World War I, on Easter Sunday in 1916, there was an uprising in Ireland. Members of the IRA captured parts of Ireland, most notably the post office in Dublin, and declared Ireland to be a free nation. However, Britain quickly ended this uprising by sending British soldiers into Ireland, and the uprising was considered a failure, and therefore tensions between Ireland and the UK, or Ireland and Britain, worsened. Following this, the Irish War for Independence began in 1919, so just after the First World War. The IRA were fighting a guerrilla war against the British and sending basically secret agents over into Britain, into England. The IRA secret agents were sent over, and Birmingham was a common choice to send secret agents to gain information about Great Britain at the time. So this is where we might expect to see some discussion of the IRA and Ireland in the first episodes of Peaky Blinders. So That brings us to the end of the discussion of the 4 socio-historical contexts and themes that I'd like you to identify in the first episodes of Peaky Blinders. And now we're going to discuss relevant theories. So the one relevant theory that we're going to be discussing today is social identity theory, that we're going to be just briefly recapping from last semester. Now this will help us to identify the identities present in Peaky Blinders and why people with different identities interact with each other in different ways. So, social identity theory was developed by Tajfel and Turner in the 1970s and 80s, but of course it explains human behaviour before and after that. It aims to explain how our identification with relevant social groups influences intergroup behaviour, so behaviour between one group and another. In short, we identify with a specific social group and we gain self-esteem from being part of that group. Therefore, we want our group to be the best, because if we identify with a group that we don't consider to be the best of the groups, then that will affect our self-esteem. We therefore dislike other groups and feel that our group is different and better. This is called positive distinctiveness, so wanting your group to be positively distinct from other groups, so better and different. Prejudice occurs as we experience in-group favouritism, so much preferring our group over the other group and therefore disliking the other group and prioritising our own. Assuming that members of our group are better than members of other groups and judging members of other groups harshly as a result of their group membership. So, here's a little cartoon that explains this. So let's say that we are in this group and these are our neighbours in this group. This is our blessed homeland. Now this group is different to our group and therefore we are going to call their homeland the barbarous wastes. We have a glorious leader, whereas they had a wicked despot. We have a great religion, whereas they have primitive superstition. We have a noble populace, whereas they are backward savages. And we have heroic adventures, whereas they are brutish invaders. So hopefully, now that we've done a very, very rudimentary and quick recap of social identity theory, you'll be able to identify how members of certain social groups in Peaky Blinders interact with other social groups in Peaky Blinders. And if you can identify these and put that on your bingo card, that will be absolutely fantastic. So now that we've covered the 4 themes that we want to look at, now we're going to cover methods of building tension on screen. So, I want you to identify how the director has created tension and built psychological suspense in the first episode of Peaky Blinders. So we're going to quickly cover methods of how directors do this. The first is by different styles of cutting and shooting, and the second will be through the use of sound. Obviously, there are hundreds of ways to build tension on screen, hundreds of ways to engage the audience. However, we're just going to be covering some of the basics right now, but please do feel free to look into more examples in your own time. Now, you might assume that using fast-paced shots would be the best way of building tension within a scene. However, actually, quite the opposite is true. A lot of directors will use slow-paced camera work and strangely timed shots in order to build suspense within the audience. Some things that I'd like you to look out for in this episode of Peaky Blinders is how the director and how the producers use camera work in order to build tension, in order to portray themes, in order to make the audience feel something. So, consider the way that the camera is moving as well as the character. So is the camera following the character? Do we feel as an audience like we're moving along with the character? What psychological impact do you think that may have? Do you think that that means that if a character is running through a scene, that the audience is also meant to feel scared? Or do you think that if a character is running through the scene, the audience is meant to feel as though they are chasing them? How have they used that camera work cleverly to engage the audience? Is the person who is speaking behind the camera? Are we watching the person who is being spoken to, or are we watching the person who is speaking? What might that be? What might the reason for that be? For the director or and the producers have chosen to create the scene that way. Are we looking from the point of view of the speaker? Do the creators of the scene want us to feel as though we are speaking or as though we are being spoken to? Are we supposed to be seeing through a character's eyes? So is this camera supposed to be the character's eyes? Rather than being behind the speaker or in front of the speaker, are we actually looking through the eyes of the speaker? Is that meant to make us feel more connected to the character? Is this supposed to build tension? Is it supposed to be humorous? And can we, the audience, see something that the character can't, or vice versa? It might build tension within the audience if we can see something that the character hasn't, if we notice something that the character doesn't, and therefore we are watching this character engage in the scene, but not knowing the full information that we know. This can build tension within the audience and create a psychological feeling within the audience, and this is what I'm hoping that you will be able to identify in Peaky Blinders. Can you see the way that the creators of this television show are using camera work and sound in order to create different psychological feelings? And I'll just give you a couple of examples of methods of building tension on screen now. This is a point of view shot taken from The Walking Dead. Now, in this scene, a character is lying on the floor with a what's it called? A barbed wire bat pointing at their face. This has the psychological impact on the audience of being able to see what it would be like if you had a barbed wire wrapped baseball bat pointed at your face. So it would instill that feeling of fear, perhaps even sympathy or empathy for the character. Now, this is quite the opposite of the point of view shot. This is the shot that's coming out of a box, or in this case a tube, a can, a vessel. So we are able to see that the characters are looking into something. Now, this is often used more comically so that the audience looks into the other characters. Now we're going to be looking at methods of building tension using sound. Now, sound can be used in a variety of ways to build tension. For example, sounds can be overwhelming. If there is a lot of sounds occurring, if there are lots of bangs and flashes and screams, then the audience might feel anxiety because they're being overwhelmed with sound, and this might create a sense of hypervigilance with the audience. They don't know what they're supposed to be looking at, much the same as the character doesn't. So helping us as the audience to empathise with that character. Or sounds can be removed completely. So if a scene is deathly silent, the viewer might find themselves holding their breath so they can hear every cue. Sometimes sound is used in a very interesting way, such as many of you might have seen films or TV shows where the character is holding a gun and shoots it. And we hear that gun ringing in their ears. We see people around them trying to talk to them, but they can't hear because they are audibly dazed by the sound of the gun in their ears. They are shocked, and therefore they can't hear everything else going on around them. So sometimes the way that directors use sound is to allow us to hear what the character is hearing. Outer sounds can be removed so that we only hear the internal sounds of the key character, such as their breathing or their heartbeat. And the score of a film can also build tension. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples in YouTube videos of where scores of TV shows and film have built tension. You can watch this in your own time if you find these particularly interesting. I'm not going to set it for everyone to do, but for those of you who are fully engaged with this lecture, who'd really like to go above and beyond, those examples will be on the next slide. Now, here we have a fantastic example of the use of sound to convey unspoken aspects of a scene. I'm not going to play it for you now simply because I can't figure out how to record sound on my screen as well as talking. But if you follow the link using the link in the PowerPoint that I've put on Moodle, it will take you to a YouTube video of a fight scene from a Sherlock Holmes film in 2010. Now, they used the score of an upbeat and exciting Irish folk song to perhaps show that the character isn't really that bothered and isn't taking the fight too seriously. They use swooshing sounds to show that the fighters are moving very quickly. You hear the cheering of the crowd, and at one point the character gets hit in the head and you hear the ringing in the character's ears, and then you hear everything around them go quiet as the character is concentrating. So, whilst sound is being used very, very cleverly to show the audience so many things about what's happening in the scene and within the character, nothing is actually explicitly said. All of these things are things that we can assume from the way that they've cleverly used sound to convey meaning.